This is the Flock and Hive podcast. I'm Helena Nicklin, and here is my full conversation with Professor Barry Smith.
I'm Barry Smith. I'm a professor of philosophy, but I also do sensory science. If people ask me what I am, I say I'm a bird that's becoming a plane, really, because I'm moving more and more into the science side. And I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of the Senses here at the University of London. And we have two working labs where we work with neuroscientists and psychologists to work on how our senses work. But we also work with chefs and perfumers and artists and filmmakers and museums and galleries. So it's exciting. There's a lot to do.
Oh, I'm sure. And there really does seem to be a movement towards even more experiential ways of talking about products and selling
Yes,
products, etc. And we
yes,
can chat
yes.
about that at the end. Okay, so quite simply, what made you decide to go into the study of the senses? And how does that work with philosophy?
Well, something very relevant to your area of expertise, and that is wine.
Haha.
So I was a philosopher of mind and language, and as a philosopher of mind, we're always talking about perception, and we tend to talk about seeing and hearing things, but the other senses don't get much mention: taste, touch, smell. And I wanted to concentrate on taste, and at the same time, I was writing in an amateur sort of way for the press about wine. And I suddenly thought, I should bring these interests together because when we're talking about tasting something like a wine, we're doing philosophical work because we say, when we say if the wine's any good, is that subjective? Is it objective? Is the taste of the wine in the glass? Is it just in my mind? Is it some relation between the two? And I eventually thought, well, I've got to stop just prosing on about how a wine tastes. I better find out how that really works. And I talked to my colleagues in neuroscience and biology, and they said, oh, it's all very complicated. There are many senses, taste, touch, and smell all working together. And that's really how I began to understand that we've misunderstood the senses until now, and we have to think again.
So there are more than five senses as well, though, aren't there?
Well,
Clearly. I mean,
there were two things that my neuroscience colleagues taught me that made me think, right, we have to start from the beginning. One is we have many more senses than five, and if you ask them how many, they'll say anywhere between 22 and 33. So that's a big shock to most people.
yeah.
The other thing they tell us is the senses don't work independently of each other. There's a lot of crosstalk. They're always influencing each other's workings. So that's what I think made me want to start a Centre for the Study of the Senses, to say, well, let's figure this out together, and let's make sure that philosophers are up to speed on all of the things that we need to be thinking about.
So you're looking very much at the interconnectedness of all the senses. And I know in the
Yes.
past we've talked about cross-modalism, but also synesthesia. Can
Mhm.
you just briefly explain what those two things are and why they're different?
Yes, we can do that. So, I mean, if we think of how the senses work together, there are ways in which some of our senses give inputs which become so integrated they produce a new thing that's not divisible into the parts. And the one that we know best is the flavor of foods and drinks, because when we're tasting something, we think we're tasting it just with the tongue, but that's not true. Because if I put a nose clip on you and I give you a jelly bean to taste, you'll say it tastes sweet, but you won't know what flavor it has. It's only when you take the jelly bean, you take the nose clip off and you get the jelly bean giving you, that aroma. You then say, oh, pineapple, cherry, and, mango, whatever. So when taste and smell combine, they produce something that you can't easily break down into which bit of it's the smell, which bit of it's the taste. And by smell, we don't mean breathing things in from the outside. We mean when the odors go from the mouth up the back of the throat to the nose, and it's when they reach the receptors there. And when you swallow, pulse odors up to the nose, that's when you get the big hit of flavor. So there you've got multisensory integration. Taste and smell are combining to produce this new thing, a flavor experience. And it's not easy to get it into its parts. Now, uh, uh, cross-modal influence is where the sound or the feel of something might change how you perceive its taste. You might make something taste sweeter or more sour by listening to a sound as you're eating. Now, there, it's not as though you've produced some third thing. You're just having an influence on how one of the senses is behaving in the light of another sense. And then synesthesia is actually where you've got associations between two senses. So quite often people will read letters and or hear words, and they think they've got colors. So they'll maybe think the name Helena is orange, and somebody else will say, no, 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 it's blue. And it's very individual what associations you have between sounds and colors or letters and colors. But cross modal influences of one sense on another, they tend to be standard across all people. So, for example, when we talk about the pitch of sound, we talk about high pitch and low pitch. But what makes it high? It's just a different sound, but it's very natural to associate a height with that high note. And then think also of smells. When you're smelling the smell of menthol, we say, "Oh, that's a high note," and the smell of leather or musk is a low note. Again, that's quite natural, but it's not as idiosyncratic as synesthesia. We all do it. And my favorite is if you ask people to say, you have to put lemons on a scale between fast and slow. Where are lemons? And everybody says,
Fast.
fast. Right.
Definitely. But why?
Banana,
Definitely
slow.
slow. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And that's shared, and that's going to be shared across the world. So it's not to do with idiosyncrasies, individual difference, and it's not cultural. So we like to find out which influences on our senses are to do with our culture and maybe our cuisine and how we grew up, and which are, as it were, wired into us. But they're not wired in that individual way that synesthesia is. We all share them.
But there must be huge implications with this. You talked about, what I've seen described as sonic seasoning, when you listen to a high pitch or something, and it might negate the need for sugar in your coffee, for example.
Yes.
There must be many kind of lifestyle areas where you can make tweaks based on sound.
Yes.
I know you've worked a lot with Charles Spence as well, I think, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Heston Blumenthal, and lots of people like that. Can you give us some more examples of how small tweaks to our
Yes,
environments
yes,
can make a
absolutely.
difference?
So Charles and I used to do the sort of dog and pony show where we would give people wines to taste, and then we would play sounds and say, "Does it taste the way? Does it change the way the taste of the wine appears?" And they'd say yes. So one thing is you give them a Sauvignon Blanc and you say, "Now concentrate on the acidity or the sourness. You got that? Yep. Now I want you to sip again, but we're going to play this very high pitched violin note. You hear this, and you see people's jaw go like that. They go, "Ooh, it's very sour." And then you say, "Okay, let's see if we can sweeten it." And then you have some nice, gentle, tinkling piano music, and they have it, and they go, "Oh, that's much better." Now, Charles says that's sonic seasoning, and I love the phrase, but I don't quite think that could work because that looks like magic. So what I think is happening is the wine has both sweetness and sourness in it. And because we've got these cross modal associations between sourness and high pitched sort of violin note, and between sweetness and something much more mellow as a note, you're just directing someone's attention to that part of the wine. And of course, if you attend to the sourness, you're not attending to the other things. So you're bringing that into view and dropping the rest. So that's one. The other one that I like and that people may already have come across is if I drew two shapes, a sort of round cloud shape and then a sort of sharp triangle shape. And I say, one of them is Kiki, one of them is Booba, which is Kiki, which is Booba. Well, everybody says Booba's the cloud shape and Kiki's the sort of angular shape. Now, again, that's universal. We have colleagues who've gone to Namibia and done this with non-literate tribes, and people get it. And small children, age of 5, they'll definitely call it out. Right now, if you think of that in terms of marketing, uh, you know, San Pellegrino, the fizzy water. When you look on the top of a San Pellegrino bottle on the cap, it's got a red star. Because if I asked you to say fizzy water, still water, which is fizzy water, Booba or Kiki?
Fizzy is definitely Kiki.
Definitely Kiki, right? And so you won't see that star on the flat, on the still aquapana because it's giving you the right association for something that's going to be fizzy versus something that's going to be still. And we can roll this out. So if I say to you, okay, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, what is milk chocolate, Booba or Kiki?
Booba.
Absolutely, right.
I
So,
mean, yes,
so it becomes very easy to roll this out. And anybody who's working in packaging or marketing or trying to advertise tastes or flavors, if they get that kind of sensory congruence wrong, then you're going to have something a little bit off-putting, and those brands often fail.
no, I bet. So I imagine that color psychology comes into this quite a lot
Yes,
as well.
yes. Well, again, lovely work done by Charles Spence, where he was giving people um, these colored liquids to drink, and some of them were lime green, some of them were deep red, some of them were yellow, and so on. And he said they may or may not have any flavor. In fact, they were tasteless dyes in water, so they didn't really have flavor. But everybody who tried them was convinced that the lime green was quite sour and the bright red was actually sweeter. And so again, we've got those natural associations from nature between redness for ripeness and greenness for unripe and sour. And if you roll those out, you can give people the right expectations and the right associations. And what will make an experience of a drink or food even better is sensory congruence. When what's going on in the other senses matches these natural associations. So, for example, if I think certainly English speakers, if you say to them, um, if something's sour, we say it tastes sharp. Now,
Yeah.
sharp's a feel, not a taste, and yet it's terribly natural to say that sour is sharp.
Mm.
These are the things that I think if people who advertise well and are brilliant at it have almost intuitively locked onto these properties. And then we come along as with psychologists and neuroscientists and so on and sensory scientists, and we say, well, that works. Why does it work? And we try to reverse engineer it and find out what are the principles behind this. Why does it work?
Mhm. Okay, and I guess it goes much further than just how we can, like fun experiments that we can do with food and wine. But I'm thinking about somebody I spoke to recently that I know Duncan Boak from Fifth
Yes,
Sense, who,
yes,
he's banging the drum for anosmia, especially since COVID. So people who've lost their
yes.
sense of taste or smell or never had it. So then, what are the implications in things like that with Kiki and Booba? Can you improve someone's experience of eating and drinking using shapes and other things that aren't smell and taste?
Well, I mean, the very sad thing for people who are anosmic and long-term anosmic, like Duncan after brain injury, or we know because we were working with patients during COVID that there are some people who still haven't got their sense of smell back, since March 2020, and some of them may not get it back. Small proportion, but some may not. When you lose your sense of smell, there's no substitute sense for that. So imagine if you lose your eyesight, you'll eventually be touching and feeling your way around your environment. You maybe be listening to get clues as to the size of the room you're in. But there is no substitute for smell. There's no simulation of it by another sense. So what we've got to do is to make food interesting in other ways. If you still have taste, then sweet and sour, those contrasts are nice, or salty and sweet. We know that's nice too. Change in temperatures, something both warm and cold. Some cold ice cream with some hot apple pie. That can be a nice, interesting contrast. Texture, to make people interested in the crunchy, stickiness, chewiness, creaminess of food. All of that can be of interest. And in a way, you've got to try to find the interest in food, maybe in spices as well, to be, well, let's add a lot to the experience of eating, because when you take smell out, you're taking rather a lot out of the picture.
A lot.
Um,
I'm thinking of brain disorders like Alzheimer's or
yes,
dementia.
yes.
Can senses or can playing with our senses help there?
Well, it's very interesting because most people who have had no experience of losing their sense of smell think of it as the sense they'd most willingly give up. If you ask people, well, if you had to do without one of your senses, which would be, and not only did they say smell, but college kids in America who were tested by Rachel Hertz said they'd rather give up their sense of smell than lose one of their social media accounts. Now,
What?
now, now they say that before they've experienced it. And the funny thing is, it's very different being on the other side. When you've lost your sense of smell, as Duncan will have told you and others will tell you, it changes the world around you. Most people who lose their sense of smell will say, I feel cut off from the world. I feel as though I'm behind glass. Now, that's very interesting because that shows you something that you didn't know until it had gone, namely that smell is part of experiencing the environment that you're living in as filling out space around you. And actually, when you smell someone's perfume, that's occupying the space between us. That's actually telling you this person is nearby. And as they leave, it sort of fades and attenuates. So there's a lot of your environment that's to do with smell, but it's not paid attention to. And it's only when it disappears that you realize it was making a contribution. Now, in COVID, it was very interesting because people lost their smell so fast. There was this huge, sudden cutoff. I had a report from a patient who had had a cup of coffee, put it down, went off to do something, came back, and when they tasted the coffee again, it just tasted like bitter water, and they'd lost the sense of smell between. So it was very quick. But with most people who are aging, it's a very slow decline. And you'll notice, we all know this with our older relatives, that they say, oh, the food doesn't taste as good as it used to, and they'll probably add more salt to it. That's because they're not getting that hit of smell. But it's interesting that loss of smell, where it's not diagnosed, it's not due to a virus, it's not due to head injury, can often be a 2 to 4 year advance warning of the onset of Parkinson's disease or dementia. So when it's a idiopathic smell loss, it can sometimes mean you should have explored and have investigated whether it's Parkinson's or whether this is the start of dementia. Now, why should smell loss accompany these neurological disorders? Well, because our smell receptors at the bridge of our nose here, they regenerate every 2 or 3 months. They're very fast regenerating our sensory neurons for smell reception. And when you lose your sense of smell, those neurons haven't regenerated. In some sense, that's an indication of neurodegeneration. It's like the canary in the cage. It's almost telling you ahead of time, why isn't that continuing as usual? So this is why medics now are beginning to pay more attention when patients turn up and say, I've lost my sense of smell. Previously, medics had the same view of it as most of the public do, that it was irrelevant. They'd say, oh, can you see, can you hear, can you stand upright? You're fine. It doesn't matter. But of course, it matters mightily. And the quality of life changes. Not only do you feel cut off from the world around you when you lose your sense of smell, and are you unable to enjoy so much pleasure from your food that flavors are reduced to just tastes and feel in the mouth, but um, intimacy is affected when you can't smell the smell of your partner, when you can't smell the smell of your children, when your own home is not familiar and easily kind of recognized. So it's an interesting, let me dwell on that a bit. It's an interesting fact that, to show you how little attention we pay to smell, most of us think our own home doesn't have a smell. And that's funny because everybody else's home's got a smell. You go and visit your friends and your neighbors and you can smell their houses, but you kind of don't know what the smell of your home is like. And that's because you've got so used to it, you're not paying attention. The brain thinks, I've got this. I don't need to keep recreating it. But when people lose their sense of smell, they often say, I feel alienated from my own home. It doesn't feel like my own home. So that shows that even though they weren't consciously attending to it, in some sense, our sense of smell was registering and the brain was registering it's familiar, everything is okay. So all of that gets disrupted with smell loss too.
Yeah. So is there anything, well, first of all, why is a smell test not regular practice at the doctors for older people? who might be
Good,
of
good,
dementia?
good question, and we're working on that. So, to test people's sense of smell, you often have to do this thing with sniffing sticks, and I'm just showing you. There's a big pile of sniffing sticks in my office now. This is a test you can do. It was invented by Thomas Hummel, who's a great smell expert in Dresden, and you need an experimenter and the participant, and it takes about 40 minutes, and it's a very long, elaborate thing. And you measure their threshold. When do they start smelling smells? When do they notice a smell? What's the threshold they have? You measure discrimination. Can they tell two smells one from the other? You do that by giving them 3 pens and asking them to say which is the odd one out. And then you've got 16 pens where for each one it's got a particular odor. It might be a food odor, it might be a flower, it might be an object, and you let them smell it and you give them 4 choices. Which is this? And again, we give them a score. So that gives you their TDI, their threshold discrimination and identification score. And it's a very reliable, objective measure of how good someone's sense of smell is. And you can tell if the sense of smell is reduced in older people, or if it's okay, if it's normal. Now, it no doctor is going to give you 40 minutes and be sitting there doing the test with you. So what we need to come up with is a very fast test, but also one that's accurate, and that's tricky. And so, with Thomas Hummel and with other collaborators, I've been trying to see if we can figure out a little test of that people could even do themselves, but where they can do it and get objective measures, and they could regularly test their sense of smell, or something you could have in a doctor's surgery that you could regularly test. And it's really about having odors that you can pair. So you're asked to smell things and say which match and put them into their pairs. And that's a really good indication of how good someone's sense of smell is.
That's a fantastic idea, and I imagine a lot more pleasant than shoving something up your nose for
Yes,
COVID. Everyone
yes,
likes to do a
yes,
little experiment.
yes.
But can you train your sense of smell? Is there anything that you can do that will help stave off something like Parkinson's or dementia by practicing smelling, for example?
Well, I don't think it'll stave off anything which is coming from elsewhere. So neurological diseases, and we still don't know what the origin of Parkinson's is. Some people think, interestingly, and this is, I think, probably the leading hypothesis, that it's due to the leaky gut. So when people have bacteria in their gut that are good, but when they have irritable bowel and the those bacteria that were so good in the gut leak out of the gut, and irritate the walls, when they get into the bloodstream and get to the brain, there may be a poisoning that goes on, and that leads to Parkinson's. So that's a that's the leading view. Now, but you can stave off, I think, dementia, and you can stave off a little bit of just generally deterioration in your senses by doing smell training. So smell training is now proven to be better at maintaining and, in fact, boosting your sense of smell. So what do you do? Well, you take 4 essential oils, and the classic 4 are lemon, eucalyptus, clove, and rose, but they could really be any 4 odors. These belong to different categories, so they're interesting. And you sniff them uh, last thing in last thing at night, first thing in the morning, and have a good old sniff. And you can even mix them up and don't look, and then decide, yes, that's eucalyptus, that's clove. And there's a very nice study done by Thomas Hummel and his colleagues in Dresden, where they took a group of 70-year-olds, and they split them in two. And one group did Sudoku for 3 months, and the other did smell training for 3 months. Now, after they came back and tested them, the Sudoku people were, of course, better at Sudoku, but they showed no other cognitive improvements. Whereas the people who did smell training were had cognitive improvement and were better and quicker at remembering names of objects, and doing naming tasks, and recalling words. So we all know, well, some of us, certainly I do by this age, that we forget people's names, and it's very difficult. We have to sort of struggle to bring them back, and that gets worse. But it turns out that smell training is actually going to keep you cognitively more active. So we should all be doing this. It's a use it or lose it sense, and you're very lucky, Helena, because you're a wine professional, and anybody who's using their nose in this way, either in the wine world or in perfume or in coffee, they are actually actively using their sense of smell, and they will have improved and developed the sense of smell well beyond their ordinary capacity. And it's a funny sense because you can't really improve your eyesight, you can't really improve your hearing. I mean, you can listen more attentively, but you can't actually make it better. Whereas you can with your sense of smell. And that's because it's sort of dormant, it's there and not used. But if you actively use it, we know that you improve and increase some of the white matter in the brain that's actually dedicated to paying attention to smell. So you'll be fine.
Well, I mean, is the amount of alcohol consumed going to negate all of that? That's the
That's right.
question.
It's swings and roundabouts. Absolutely.
I also get very annoyed with people sometimes if they're wearing like really shouty,
Yeah.
when a smell or a perfume or an aftershave is really shouty, it's
Yeah.
offensive. So offensive.
Young boys who's spraying on their deodorant, it sort of grabs you around the throat sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think what they don't know is when they spray it on and they like the smell, after a while they get used to that smell, so it'll decrease to them.
Mm.
So then they think, oh, I better spray more on, and then it decreases, and this goes on until, as teachers know, they walk into a classroom and they're like, oh my god, they're just hit with Lynx Africa, whatever it
I
is
was
that the
gonna
young
say,
boys think is going to make them smell cool. Yeah,
it's always going to be Lynx Africa. That's
yeah,
hilarious.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So, are there any other examples of things that people could do every day? Really simple things to do with our senses that might, I don't know, enhance cognitive ability. Or I know that certain aromas, if you think of aromatherapy, have different effects on like your well-being, etc. But have you discovered anything recently that's particularly exciting in that realm?
Ooh, in that
Two different
respect, well,
questions.
I think I, I I think I love people to slow down and pay attention to what's going on when they're tasting or eating, because I believe that we'll eat less and be satisfied sooner if we get more out of the experience of eating. So quite often when we're not paying attention, we're sort of shoveling things in and we chew and swallow and it's gone. Whereas taking a little moment to experience what's happening. So, for example, with chocolate, with commercial chocolate, it melts so quickly. It melts in your hand. As soon as you take it into your fingers, it's sort of running in your hand because it's got so much palm oil, or if you're lucky, cocoa butter in it, but not much cocoa solid. But if you get a decent piece of craft chocolate and you put it in your mouth, sort of 60%, 75% chocolate, pay attention to the melt rate. Pay attention to how slowly it goes from being a sort of hard piece of plastic that's just lying there to suddenly something that becomes gooey and soft and luxurious. And it's then that the flavors are released. Now you're getting the sweetness or a bit of sourness. Now you're getting the fruitiness or the sort of coffee taste or the woody taste of it. And there's a lovely experiment that people can do, which is they get a decent piece of good chocolate, high cocoa solid. Um, Try eating it very slowly. So put it in the mouth, don't chew it, but just move it around, and the heat of the tongue will make it melt. And write down all the things you've noticed about it, the texture, the taste, the sweetness, the sourness, any bitterness that you detect there. Is it sort of meaty or soy-like? Is it woody? What are you picking up? Is it raspberry that you're noticing? So you do that. You see you've got lists of descriptions. Now take another piece and eat it as quickly as you can. Quick. And I do this by asking people, put your hand up when you've finished. It's a race. And they swallow it. And you say, what did you get? And they say, almost nothing, or just chocolate. And now you'll notice that, what you taste depends on how you taste.
Hmm.
And actually taking that little time and paying attention, it gives you a richer experience. And you'll find that you don't need to keep dousing yourself. You're kind of satisfied and think, yeah, that was a lot was going on and I enjoyed it and I savored it. And the same is true of wines. I mean, I think both of
Yeah, I
us
was
would
going to
be,
say.
yeah, I mean, we all know we've got to be careful with the amount of alcohol we drink. So if you drink something better, where there's more complexity, more interest, more things to notice in each sip or mouthful, you don't need to go on guzzling it because you sort of think, gosh, that was great. You have a glass and another half glass and you think, lovely. Whereas, when I'm given a much lesser wine, I find myself drinking more as if I'm trying to extract the goodness out of it.
I'm
Come on.
exactly the same, and it's the same with like a piece of, a very cheap commercial chocolate, shall we
Yeah.
say? Mentioning no
Yeah.
names, I have a lot of it because I'm trying
Yes.
to get anything.
Yes. You want to have something that's really satisfying. So one top tip is, you know, take something more complex, more interesting, and take your time and notice it and savor it. And I think it will satisfy you sooner. There's
Mm-hmm.
also something interesting about how much we eat. So, we can be sitting in front of the television and we can be sort of consuming huge amounts of food because we're not paying attention to what's on the plate. We're looking and we're just sort of shoveling it in. It turns out that what is regulating your intake is not a real time feeling of how full you are. That's not what's going on. What's actually going on in the brain is a prediction about how full you'll be and how many nutrients you'll get after eating this much food. So when you look at the size of the plate, your brain has learned when I eat all of that, an hour or so later, I feel like this. But if you're not looking at it because you're watching TV and you're shoveling it in, you'll eat more. Now we know some of this because lovely experiments done by a collaborator of mine, Martin Yeomans, psychologist from Sussex. He was giving undergraduates bowls of tomato soup to eat, but unbeknownst to them, there was a hole in the soup bowl and a pipe coming from under the table, and it was refilling very slowly the soup bowl. They ate gallons of it before they decided I'd had enough because they just looked and thought, I'll just finish this. So it's not real time measurement. And of course, this is very dangerous when a lot of ready meals and takeaways have actually got enormous calories in them for each plateful. So a plate that you just have a plateful of food, you think, well, I kind of know how much I'm eating. They can have about, you know, 1,750 calories in that plateful. That's almost your daily calorie intake. But you will eat it because you think I'm only having a plateful. Very bad. And about an hour later, you'll think, oh, I don't feel so good. So pay attention to eating. Pay attention to how much you're eating, and pay attention to what's happening and what you're enjoying as you eat. I think that'll give you a much better quality of life.
And no eating in front of the telly, absolutely not. That's a very good reminder, actually. So you just miss it all. Great, thank you very much. So you've been working with all of these things for a very long time. Is there anything that's been really recent that is exciting that you can talk about in terms of sensory research?
Mm. I do think we're getting much more interested in the effects of touch on not just taste, but also the quality of sound that we have. And exploring things with our fingers is actually it's the first, as it were, first draft of how something's going to taste. So when you feel something, you almost know what it's going to be like when you put it in your mouth. So you can affect whether a chocolate tastes creamy and soft or a little bit coarse by rubbing Velcro or velvet when you touch it, and that makes a difference. So that means that packaging is quite important when you're eating something, and there are a number of things that you could play with there. Another thing that's interesting is in virtual reality. So I had a colleague who was working on an Oculus project, which was when you're looking at things in a virtual reality screen, if we're eye tracking and finding out where they're looking when the hand in virtual reality is about to touch, if just before they touch the thing they're looking at, we can stimulate the ends of their fingers, it can give them a feeling as though they're actually touching something in the virtual world. So that's quite cool to sort of induce these experiences. Also, my colleague Ophelia Darwa is doing wonderful work with she did some work with Sir Simon Rattle when he's conducting the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, and she had eye tracking glasses on. And what he's doing when he's conducting is he's reading the music ahead of the time when they're playing. He's looking up, and he often looks up to the top corner to sort of think what he wants, and then he instructs the orchestra. So he is doing several things at once. He's reading ahead, he's thinking, and then he's moving and coordinating his movements to how he wants the musicians to match what he's interpreting the music to do. The amount of cross modal interaction between the senses there is enormous. And because you can then show a film from his point of view with the eye tracking dots, you can see all of this going on in real time. And I think that's a very, very cool piece of work.
That is, wow, how amazing are our brains. That's insane. It reminds me, actually, I read something recently that a tequila brand uh, had put into practice. They got Charles Spence to write them a whole thing on how watching a very quick TV program, something like Succession, where there's a lot of chat very quickly and it's quite cerebral, can actually enhance what you get out of wine and spirits, or anything that you're eating, basically, in
Right,
terms of
right.
flavor, because you're able to pick out more. Do you know
Yeah.
anything about that?
I don't, but I can imagine because Charles' work is so imaginative that he would do that. One thing that I found out recently, and I'm very proud of, is when you're taking something like a scotch and a decent whiskey, a lot of people will say, I want to drink it neat, which is hard to do because, it's 43% alcohol, or if it's cask strength, it's up to sort of 57. That's really burningly hot in the mouth. That's going to be fiery, and it's not going to be so pleasant. But here's how you can enjoy the taste of that without the burn. You first give people wasabi nuts to chew on, and the trigeminal nerve, which gets irritated by spice, you get that burny heat of eating wasabi. And then when you sip the whiskey, there's no burn and you just taste the flavor. So
Oh my
that's, yeah,
goodness.
so that's the way to neutralize the burn, focus on the flavor, but, don't do it too often. It's still 43%.
Everything in moderation,
Everything in
including
moderation.
moderation. Yeah, because the wasabi would have already blown your head off. So
That's right.
about
That's
that.
right. But that was fun to find out that
Yeah.
you can and what's happening is, of course, when you feel the burn of alcohol, that's trigeminal nerve irritation. So if you just do that in advance, you're up to max. So when that comes in, the brain says, "Got that," not paying attention, and then it focuses on everything that's left.
Oh, I love that. So apart from tasting whiskey and wine and appreciating lovely perfumes and fragrances, is there anything that you found that you do? Obviously, we've talked about the smell training, morning and evening. As a result of your research?
Yes, I've just become more and more interested in touch and texture, and certainly the texture of food.
Oh,
So it's always said that the Japanese and the Chinese have got about 140 words for mouthfeel for the different texture of food, and we've got about 14. And actually, we pay far too little attention to the textures of foods. And I think I've learned a lot from Ollie Muritzen, who's a gastrophysicist in Denmark, who's got a wonderful book I recommend to people called Mouthfeel. And Ollie points out almost every complaint in a restaurant is to do with the sense of touch. The steak was too tough, the eggs were too runny, the wine was too warm, the coffee was too cold. And that's right. And I think we then find people's preferences for foods are very related to differences in textures that they like. So I could probably put you on a scale, Helena, as to how hard or runny you like your scrambled eggs. And wherever you are on that scale, you won't want to go elsewhere. People will say, "Oh, I can't have runny bits," or some people say, "I can't have those hard bits." And then similarly with how you like meat cooked, whether you like it, medium, rare, blue, well done, and so on. So I think a lot of our preferences are about texture, and I'm paying so much more attention now in food to texture, and I'm getting I'm getting to be a sort of connoisseur of texture and change of textures we're eating, and it's transferring. I'm much more sensitive in wine to the textures of individual wines and even of whiskies, which despite the fact that they're oily and highly alcoholic, they've got very different textures. So
Mm, mm.
that's changed in me a lot, I think.
Absolutely. Well, that's interesting for me too. It means that I might have to speak to you again all about when we're taking a deeper dive into touch and texture.
Yes.
Yes, for one of those. Well, thank you. Obviously, we could go on for hours, but I would love it if we could chat again. But finally, I'd love to ask you, what is your own definition of the art of living?
I think the art of living is to try to stay in balance as much as possible. And what does that mean? Well, it's a balance between the many senses and experiences that we're subject to, which is cognitive, sensory, emotional. Uh, it's the balance between getting too excited and having a bit of calm down time. It's the balance between uh, eating and enjoying many things and not overeating. And I think it's counter numbness. Don't stay in front of screens and just have audio visual experiences. Make sure you're using all of your senses and enjoy them, because our experience is always multisensory. We're always taking in many things at the same time. So enjoy the richness of that, and don't neglect to think of yourself as an embodied being in contact with others around you.
Well, with that in mind, I think our next meeting should be in person over a glass of wine.
I think so. With pleasure.
Professor Barry Smith, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.